Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Work Less, New Strategies for a Changing Workplace by Jon Peirce, narrated by Dean Gallagher. Publisher's note: in this audio edition you will hear references to tables present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Introduction. Suddenly the time is now once again. When one reaches a certain age and stage of life, bookshelf space is at a premium. With an eye to making more, I found myself one raw January day early in 2022 looking over a bookcase beside my office desk where I expected to find 3 or 4 likely candidates for the give-a-book/take-a-book wooden box down Gatineau's Rue Jacques Cartier from me. I needed space for a number of Christmas books still sitting in their gift bags, waiting for a more permanent home, and for others I expected to be receiving shortly. Half an hour's search having turned up nothing I was willing to part with, I was about to give up and switch to some more productive activity when suddenly my eye was caught by a bright yellow binding. The binding alone made the book stand out on my generally somber-looking shelves. Few of my books have ever had brightly colored covers, and even those few, Montaigne's Essay in the original French is one that comes to mind, have long since faded after decades in my possession. In contrast, this book had the bright, cheerful sheen of a new arrival. Now my curiosity was piqued. I hadn't bought many books at all in recent years, and those I had bought typically had covers as drab as those adorning instruction manuals. What could this book possibly be, standing out as clearly from the rest of my collection as a yellow warbler amid a pack of slate-colored juncos? On taking the book down, I was surprised to discover it was none other than Bruce O'Hara's Working Harder Isn't Working, a book I'd eagerly purchased back in the 1990s when I was doing serious research into work hours, but was not sure I still had in my possession. I remembered having read the book eagerly, pleased to discover a kindred spirit in my quest for shorter hours, which in those recessionary days was viewed primarily as a job creation mechanism. O'Hara was an important source for the major study I did on work hours between 1997 and 2000. But once I'd finished that study, my interests shifted, to the extent that I did no further research on the subject through the century's first 2 decades. My first reaction was one of joy, as if I'd just run into a long-lost friend. Seeing the book took me back to the days not all that long ago when work hours had actually had a place on Canadian policymakers' agendas, albeit not a very elevated place. Its place on European policymakers' agendas, as we'll discuss in a later chapter, was and still is a far loftier one. But that initial joy soon gave way to sadness. Quite simply, it appeared that no one gave a damn about work hours anymore. It had been at least 15 years since I'd even heard the subject mentioned. Meanwhile, people, other than retirees like me, seemed to be working harder than ever. Was this just another of the many windmills I'd tilted at in my youth and early middle age, to little lasting effect? If so, I would be keeping the book for purely sentimental reasons. Self-discipline and a continuing need to declutter dictated I should probably cull it. For 20 minutes I sat racked with indecision, forgetting the minor Victorian novels and obscure poetry collections that might also have been good candidates for culling. Finally, I decided to return the book to the shelf, at least for the time being. Whether or not I would ever read it again, its yellow binding lent a touch of color to my otherwise drab book collection, and might at least help cheer me up on dull gray winter days. While many a book has been sold because of its cover, This could just have been the first recorded instance of a book having been saved because of its cover. A few weeks later, having by this time again forgotten about O'Hara, and having satisfied my decluttering impulse by consigning half a dozen fourth-tier Victorian and contemporary novels to the little wooden box, I found myself thinking about work hours for the first time in many years. The reason for that was a piece I'd read on CBC News about a Toronto firm that, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, had decided to go to a 4-day week, both as a recruitment incentive and to improve the health and job satisfaction of existing employees. Intrigued and delighted, I recalled my earlier research on the subject and put together a CBC opinion piece advocating for a more general adoption of shorter hours. To my amazement, the piece was accepted and then published on CBC's website within a week of my having conceived it. Even the modest amount of research I did for the piece revealed that the 4-day week in particular had once again become a hot-button topic. I discovered organizations in the United Kingdom and New Zealand, as well as firms in Canada, working for its adoption. I also found that an NDP member of Ontario's legislature and a Democratic member of the U.S. House of Representatives had, independently of each other, introduced legislation to enact the 4-day week into law. But it was the response to the CBC opinion piece that really suggested I was onto something big. Within 2 days after the piece's initial appearance, I had TV and radio interviews lined up, and the piece itself would garner 1,000 comments before CBC closed off commenting altogether. Friends and colleagues who'd been made aware of my burgeoning interest in the subject began emailing me all manner of articles and research studies, and each day the Internet news seemed to include several more articles on the subject. Clearly, I'd made the right decision by keeping the O'Hara book. The rightness of that decision was confirmed when, less than a month after the publication of the CBC opinion piece, I signed a contract with Dundurn Press to produce a book on work hours. And so here we are. Where will we be going in this book? Because the connection between overwork and physical and mental health issues has become so clear since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, I began with a chapter titled Working Ourselves Sick, in which I lay out the current situation with regard to work hours and physical and mental health. The discussion then turns to the history of the struggle for shorter work hours. As students of the Canadian labor movement will be aware, that struggle was one of the key issues around which Canadian workers and the unions representing them organized in the late 19th century, establishing, among other things, 9-hour leagues in Hamilton and Montreal. It would continue to be a significant issue for the Trades and Labor Congress, Canada's first national labor confederation, through the earlier part of the 20th century. And it was an equally important issue throughout the early days of the American labor movement. Accordingly, the next series of chapters is devoted to the history of the shorter work hours struggle. The series begins with chapters on the evolution of work hours in the United States and Canada, respectively. It will be followed by a chapter on the evolution of work hours in Europe and other countries around the world, including both long industrialized countries, such as France and the United Kingdom, and newly industrializing countries, such as South Korea and Singapore. The historical section closes with a chapter on the 1920s, a period that warrants special attention for a number of reasons, both because it was the one period when employers and their employees were often in agreement about the value of shorter hours, and because these were the years that saw the greatest reduction of work hours yet known. Beyond that, the 1920s also merit close study because of all the periods in relatively recent history, they most closely resemble our own period. Like the 2020s, the 1920s were ushered in with a global pandemic. Both eras experienced major wars as well, although the Russia-Ukraine conflict has not as yet attained global proportions. As was the case a century ago, the traumatic events of the present decade have inspired people of goodwill, including many in management, to seek to make workplaces more welcoming. Shorter work hours are a key part of that quest. This chapter on the 1920s will serve as a bridge between past history and future possibilities, as it has close links to both. It is followed by a series of chapters that look at recent developments related to work hours. The first of those chapters will consider the intensification of work resulting from both conventional computer technology in the 1980s and more recent technologies such as Zoom that have facilitated the growth of off-site employment. This will be followed by a chapter titled The Great Resignation, in which I lay out the dynamics of the post-pandemic labor market, one in which there are serious labor shortages for the first time in decades, and in which, having the upper hand for the first time in decades, workers worn to a frazzle by overwork are quitting their jobs with increasing frequency, confident that they can easily find other jobs if and when they need to. The next chapter will deal with workers' right to disconnect, a particularly important issue at a time when the distinction between work life and home life has become increasingly blurred, and many workers have come to believe they must respond immediately to all electronic communications from their employers, regardless of the inconvenience or cost to their personal lives. The issue, which some governments and employers had begun to address even prior to the pandemic, has taken on added importance since the onset of the pandemic, which saw many workers forced to work from their homes or from other remote sites. A third chapter will address the rise of that off-site employment, a phenomenon that offers many opportunities for workers and employers, but also poses many challenges. A key element of this chapter will be the rise of hybrid workplaces, or workplaces at which employees are physically present for part but not all of the work week, and the productivity issues arising from the growth of hybrid workplaces. The book's final section will consider the current situation, both in Canada and in other countries, with respect to work hours, what shorter hours initiatives are currently underway, and what more needs to be done by different players, including employers, workers, and their unions, and governments at all levels. This section discusses shorter work hours initiatives currently underway and recently completed, including legislative initiatives such as those recently introduced in Ontario and the United States, and private sector initiatives such as the shorter week trials just completed under the auspices of 4-Day Week Global, Work Time Reduction Center Excellence, and other like-minded organizations. The section will also consider how such initiatives are progressing, what their likelihood of success appears to be, and which industrial sectors and jurisdictions appear to offer the most promising environment for adoption of a shorter workweek. Included in this policy discussion will be the aforementioned right to disconnect initiatives, which are extremely important since shorter official hours won't mean much if employers can still contact employees outside of regular hours whenever they want. The section and the book will close with a series of recommendations directed variously at all the major players in the work hours game, from international bodies such as the International Labor Organization, ILO, to individual firms. In connection with these recommendations, one important caveat is in order. While the recommendations are intended to apply as broadly as possible through the labor force, not everyone will benefit equally from them. A reduction in the maximum allowable weekly work hours will be of little benefit to part-timers and would likely have no applicability at all to those working in the gig economy. Shorter maximum hours are also unlikely to be of much benefit to temporary foreign agricultural workers, for whom enforcement of any sort of hours legislation has always been problematic. But this doesn't mean that the entire recommendation list is of no value whatever to members of the mentioned groups. The right to disconnect, for example, would apply in all cases where workers are asked to communicate with their employers outside of their normal work hours, whatever those normal work hours might be. Similarly, prohibitions against electronic monitoring would apply to all workers, including part-timers and those working on a gig basis. And part-timers, as well as full-timers, would benefit from the increased vacation time I have proposed. Beyond that, it could fairly be argued that one of the benefits of shorter work hours and increased restrictions on overtime would likely be the creation of new full-time jobs. Instead of making staff work additional overtime to meet steady increases in demand, employers would have no choice other than to hire more people. With the creation of such jobs, at least a certain number of those now working part-time or in the gig economy would be able to move into more secure full-time jobs. Because the serious physical and mental health effects of overwork have been driving recent government policy initiatives, employer initiatives, and the set of employee behaviors summed up in the phrase "the Great Resignation," described in detail in Chapter 7, it's to these physical and mental health effects that the discussion now turns. Chapter 1. Working Ourselves Sick. One of the truths hammered home by the COVID-19 pandemic is that we are working ourselves sick. Not that this is anything new. Writers as diverse as Bertrand Russell, John Maynard Keynes, Andrew Barnes, Bruce O'Hara, and Juliet Schor have been shining a spotlight on this issue for decades. As will be noted in more detail later in the chapter, individual workers are not the only victims. The healthcare systems and the environment have also been paying the price for all this overwork. Writing in 1993, near the trough of a major recession, O'Hara said, "The health costs many of us pay are not Medicare premiums. Insomnia, eczema, digestive upsets, asthma, traffic accidents, back pain, and heart troubles are often the physical symptoms of overstressed lives. The health crises of those dear to us, be they alcoholism, suicide, ulcers, or a nervous breakdown, may also have their roots in stress and overwork." Over a quarter of a century later, Barnes, in his 4-Day Week, How the Flexible Work Revolution Can Increase Productivity, Profitability, and Well-Being, and Help Create a Sustainable Future, would note, in the UK, work-related stress, anxiety, or depression now accounts for 57% of all working days lost to ill health. The Society of Occupational Medicine reports that each year, about 400,000 UK workers report illness that they attribute to work-related stress. Between 2017 and 2018, 15.4 million working days were lost to mental illness connected to work, up from 12.5 million the previous year. More succinctly, Barnes has noted, when punishing work schedules become the norm, workers at every level pay the price with their physical and mental health. And in the United States, it is much the same as in Canada and the United Kingdom. Economist Juliet Schor has noted that, due largely to overwork, when we count not only our incomes but also trends in free time, public safety, environmental quality, income distribution, teen suicide, and child abuse, we find that things have been getting worse for more than 20 years, even though consumption has been rising. These statements by O'Hara, Barnes, and Shore mirror earlier findings by people like Johns Hopkins University epidemiologist Harvey Brenner, who found that increasing levels of overwork led to increased hospital admissions. One major reason for increasing levels of overwork over the past 2 decades is the spread of on-call work, once required only in life-and-death professions, such as emergency medicine, firefighting, and midwifery, into most white-collar and professional fields. If you are over 50, perhaps you'll remember feeling sorry for the people required to carry huge cell phones, or who had to wear pagers on their belts. These were the folks liable at a moment's notice to be called away from a gripping movie or an enjoyable restaurant dinner to attend to some emergency or another. If someone had conducted a survey in, say, 1995, asking people if they too would like to be able to connect instantly to the outside world in order to do their jobs better, I'm sure the positive response rate would have been below 5%. That notwithstanding, what with the internet and cell phones, we are in a very real sense almost all in the same position as the firefighters and emergency medical personnel of a generation ago, except that few of us receive the premium pay that many of those emergency workers of a generation ago would have received to compensate them, at least in part for the disruption to their personal lives caused by their being on call. It is, above all else, the Internet that has, in Barnes's words, made obsolete the rule of business hours and replaced it with a state of permaworking, in which employees are tacitly expected to focus solely on work to the exclusion of family life and outside pursuits. At least up until the COVID-19 pandemic, those unwilling to focus their lives entirely on work, such as women raising families or caring for aging relatives, were at serious risk of losing opportunities for career advancement, the assumption being that people unwilling to work at night or on weekends were insufficiently dedicated to the organization to warrant consideration for promotion, or perhaps to even continue holding their present positions. Such organizational cultures breed workaholism in the same way swamps breed mosquitoes. They have indeed turned workaholism from an occasional disease found mainly among troubled souls into a veritable epidemic. As Barnes has noted, while there have always been workaholics, a compulsion to work was previously understood as a choice, or, at worst, the product of a specific company's culture, not the manifestation of a larger cultural mandate. At least until the COVID-19 pandemic arrived and caused many workers to start reevaluating their entire work situations, workaholism simply came with the territory of professional work, particularly work with technology firms. Although it's important to note in this connection that the technology industry is not monolithic, and some high-tech firms have been in the vanguard of the shorter hours movement. This has led not only to severe physical and mental health impacts on individual workers, but, as will be discussed in more detail later in the chapter, to added stress on already overburdened healthcare systems. These physical and mental health impacts, along with the burden on healthcare systems, increased markedly during the pandemic. With many workers falling victim to COVID or unable to work because they couldn't obtain adequate child care, the burden increased on those continuing to work. For the year 2020, the Microsoft Work Trend Index reported an increase in the workday of 27% in the United Kingdom, 25% in the United States, and a whopping 45% in Australia. That index identified unmanageable workloads/work hours and a lack of separation between work and home life as 2 of 4 major stressors on remote workers. A Microsoft Index survey conducted in January of the following year found continued high productivity masking an exhausted workforce. 1 in 5 global survey respondents said their employer didn't care about their work-life balance, while 54% reported feeling overworked and 39% exhausted. No doubt these feelings of increased stress and the reality of overwork resulted at least in part from a substantial increase in the digital intensity of workers' days. The result, in particular, of the greatly increased use of Zoom and other technologies enabling remote work. These technologies, whose effects will be discussed in greater detail in a later chapter, have brought with them specific physical and mental effects, such as headaches, stiff necks, and anxiety, going above and beyond the stress effects workers were experiencing prior to the pandemic. A question that might fairly be asked at this point is why, if overwork has such severe health impacts, it has been allowed to continue and even increase. One reason is that for decades prior to the pandemic, owing in large measure to economic developments such as globalization, competition from less developed countries, and the privatization of government-run enterprises, employers have held the whip hand in most Western countries. At the same time, the decline of unionization, driven in part by a structural economic shift away from manufacturing and in the direction of hard-to-organize service industries, has meant that employers have increasingly been free of any significant challenge to their workplace hegemony. Anthony Veal is one but a number of recent commentators pointing to the significant decline in workers' collective bargaining power that has occurred in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. This long-term weakening of the labor movement has, among other things, had the effect of making it more difficult for workers seeking to challenge employers' demands on issues such as work hours without fear of reprisal. The trend toward longer hours somehow endured, despite evidence accumulated over more than a century that longer hours wouldn't lead to increased productivity. As early as the 1890s, various European chemical industry firms, discussed in some detail in Chapter 5, had found that reducing their work hours had led to increased productivity and lower absenteeism and sick rates, while in 1920, as is noted in Chapter 2, prominent labor economist John R. Commons said the most important lesson the First World War had taught industry was that long hours don't pay. Closer to our time, a 2017 UK study of office workers showed that nearly 80% of respondents did not consider themselves to be productive throughout the entire working day, while over half, 54%, said that distractions such as social media and news websites, making personal calls and texts, talking to coworkers about non-work-related matters, searching for new jobs, taking smoke breaks, and preparing food and drinks made the working day more bearable. Even starker evidence is provided in an article in The Economist, the article that Andrew Barnes says gave rise to his work on the 4-day week, that cites studies showing British workers to be productive for an average of 2.5 hours per standard working day. Without revealing any secrets from my own work history, I would hazard a guess that the studies just cited don't tell seasoned office workers much that they were not already well aware of. Why, in the face of such strong evidence that longer hours were, if anything, making workers less productive rather than more, should the long hours culture have continued to hold sway for as long as it did? The answer, according to Barnes, is simple. Few employers actually know how to measure output.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?